45 Historical Lies That Modern Evidence Destroyed. I assent. Just a deep dive into history, it's the shocking truth behind the deceptions that shaped entire nations. For centuries, power was held together by lies, carefully crafted to manipulate the masses. But modern evidence has ripped through these falsehoods, exposing the twisted truth beneath. What was once considered history's undeniable reality is now crumbling under the weight of undeniable proof. Get ready to uncover the lies that changed the world and see how they were weaponized for power. Chapter 1. The Trojan Horse. Ingenious tactic or propaganda? The story of the Trojan horse has been immortalized as a brilliant military tactic, Greeks tricking the Trojans into bringing their doom right inside the city's walls. But what if this legendary victory was nothing more than a propaganda tool, carefully constructed to justify Greek imperialism? The Greeks wanted the world to believe their victory was a triumph of wit, but modern evidence suggests the truth was much darker. The tale of the horse was invented not just to celebrate a cunning strategy, but to solidify the Greeks' heroic status and glorify their conquest. It wasn't the gods who orchestrated this miraculous win, it was the Greeks themselves fabricating the myth to mask the brutality of their siege. The Trojan horse wasn't just a vehicle of destruction, but a weapon of persuasion, used to control how the story of war would be told for generations. And this wasn't the first time a military victory was twisted into something far more glorious than it really was. But the Greeks weren't the only ones using deception to manipulate the truth. Chapter 2. The Myth of Julius Caesar's Assassination. Julius Caesar's assassination is often portrayed as the noble act of patriotic senators, saving the Republic from tyranny. But the truth behind his death is far darker. The murder was not an act of heroism, it was a carefully calculated move to seize power. Modern evidence reveals the conspirators had personal ambitions, not the welfare of Rome in mind. They manipulated the public, painting Caesar as a dictator who threatened the Republic's very existence. In reality, Caesar's reign was one of expansion, reform, and unprecedented success. But his power made those in the Senate fear for their own positions. The lie that he was a tyrant was used to justify their brutal and selfish actions. Caesar's death wasn't the preservation of democracy, it was a grab for power by those who could not accept his dominance. This wasn't just the fall of a leader, it was a political maneuver that would reshape Rome's future forever. But behind every political assassination, there's a story of power that's too dangerous to remain buried. Chapter 3. The Crusades. Religious war or political power grab. The Crusades have long been taught as holy wars to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity. The truth, however, is far more complex and far more sinister. While the Church and European monarchs rallied the masses with cries of faith and salvation, the Crusades were as much about power and wealth as they were about religion. The Church sought to consolidate its influence across Europe, while kings and lords saw an opportunity to expand their territories. The promise of heaven's reward was used to manipulate peasants into fighting, masking the very real ambitions of those in charge. Evidence shows that the Crusades were driven by political motives, with the Church using religion as a tool to control the masses. Jerusalem wasn't the only prize. Land, treasure, and prestige were up for grabs. What was sold as a divine mission was, in reality, a power grab masked by religious fervor, with millions of lives caught in the crossfire. But this wasn't the first time religion was weaponized for power. Chapter 4. Napoleon's Defeat. The myth of Waterloo. Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo is often remembered as the end of his empire, a conclusive moment in history. But the reality behind his downfall is more complicated and far less glorious. What history rarely mentions is the betrayal and political maneuvering that played a key role in his defeat. Modern analysis reveals that Napoleon's once powerful army was weakened by internal divisions, logistical failures, and a lack of support from his allies. Waterloo wasn't just a military defeat, it was the result of a series of political miscalculations. But the myth of Waterloo, crafted by the victors, painted Napoleon's fall as inevitable, downplaying the forces that were quietly working against him long before the battle began. This was not a hero's tragic end. It was a carefully orchestrated event, designed to remove him from power and rewrite history in favor of those who sought to control Europe. But Napoleon wasn't the only leader to be brought down by a strategic lie. Chapter 5. The Real Cause of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is often portrayed as a heroic fight for freedom from British tyranny. But the truth behind the revolution is far more complex and far more self-serving. While many believe the colonies fought for liberty, modern evidence suggests that economic and political power were at the heart of the conflict. The colonial elites, who stood to lose their wealth and influence under British rule, manipulated public sentiment, framing the revolution as a battle for freedom. The rebellion wasn't a grassroots movement driven by a desire for equality. It was a calculated effort by wealthy landowners to protect their interests and expand their control. The cries of no taxation without representation masked the deeper desire for independence from British economic policies that threatened their dominance. What we've been taught as a fight for freedom was, in fact, a struggle for the rich to maintain their hold on power. And just like the American colonists, other revolutions were equally shaped by hidden motivations. Chapter 6. The Great Wall of China, Protection or Control. The Great Wall of China has long been celebrated as a symbol of strength, a protective barrier keeping out invaders. But what if the wall's real purpose wasn't protection, but control? Evidence suggests that the wall was built not just to keep enemies at bay, but to prevent the Chinese people from escaping the empire. The emperor's real concern wasn't foreign threats, it was internal rebellion. The wall was a physical manifestation of power, a way to control the masses and prevent dissent. It also helped consolidate the emperor's rule, maintaining order in an empire constantly on the brink of revolt. The myth of the Great Wall. As a defensive structure hid the true reality, it was a tool for suppressing the population and keeping the empire's fragile power intact. This was not a wall built to protect China from the outside, but a wall designed to keep its people in line. But the Chinese weren't the only ones using walls to control their people. Chapter 7. The Battle of Thermopylae, Heroism or Manipulation. The Battle of Thermopylae is immortalized as one of the greatest acts of heroism in history, where 300 Spartans made a stand against the mighty Persian Empire. But the truth behind this legendary battle is more about political manipulation than heroism. Modern research suggests that the story was twisted to glorify Sparta and enhance its political power. The Spartans weren't fighting solely for freedom, they were using the battle to build a myth of invincibility, one that would elevate their status among the Greek city-states. In truth, Thermopylae was a strategic move to enhance Spartan dominance, wrapped in the cloak of self-sacrifice. While the 300 may have fought valiantly, they were also pawns in a much larger game, manipulated by leaders who sought to solidify their control over Greece. The myth of Thermopylae didn't just glorify Sparta's bravery, it made it an unstoppable force in the ancient world. This myth of heroism wasn't just confined to the ancient world. Chapter 8. The Myth of Cleopatra's Beauty. Cleopatra has been immortalized as the epitome of beauty and seduction, wielding her charm to control two of Rome's most powerful leaders, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But what if the real story wasn't about her beauty at all? Evidence suggests Cleopatra's image was crafted as a political tool. She wasn't simply a captivating queen, she was a shrewd, politically savvy ruler who knew how to use her relationships to secure Egypt's place in the world. Her beauty wasn't her greatest weapon, her intellect, political acumen, and ability to manipulate the men around her were. The myth of Cleopatra's beauty was a creation of Roman propaganda, designed to diminish her true power and reduce her to a mere seductress. This was a story written by the victors, a story that masked her real legacy as one of the most powerful and strategic rulers of her time. But Cleopatra's manipulation of power wasn't the first, nor the last, to be masked as a romantic tale. Chapter 9. The Salem Witch Trials, Mass Hysteria, or Political Tool. The Salem witch trials are often portrayed as a tragic example of mass hysteria, where innocent women were wrongly accused of witchcraft. But the truth is far darker. The trials weren't simply a religious frenzy, they were a politically motivated campaign designed to eliminate rivals and consolidate power. Evidence shows that those accused were often enemies of the wealthy elite, and the trials were used as a tool to settle old scores. The hysteria that spread through Salem wasn't driven purely by fear, it was orchestrated by those in power to maintain control and suppress any dissent. While innocent lives were destroyed, the real beneficiaries were those who manipulated the trials for their own gain. The trials weren't a tragic accident, were a calculated effort to use fear and superstition as tools of political control. And it wasn't just small towns that used fear for power. Chapter 10. The Myth of King Arthur, History or Political Construct. The legend of King Arthur has been woven into the fabric of British identity, celebrated as the embodiment of chivalry and virtue. But what if Arthur wasn't a king at all? The myth of King Arthur was likely created centuries after the supposed events, constructed by later rulers to legitimize their own power and unite a fractured kingdom. Evidence suggests that the Arthurian legends were not based on a single historical figure, but rather a composite of various leaders and warriors. Myth was a political construct designed to create a unified British identity in the face of Norman occupation. What was presented as a tale of bravery and honor was, in reality, a tool for consolidating power, masking the true struggles and division within early medieval Britain. The story of King Arthur wasn't just a legend, it was a political strategy used to manipulate the people and control a nation's narrative. But creating a myth for political power is nothing new. Chapter 11. The Spanish Armada, a noble defense or a failure of leadership. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is often framed as a miraculous victory for England, a testament to Queen Elizabeth's leadership and the power of the English navy. But the reality behind the defeat is much murkier. While the English celebrated their victory, modern evidence reveals that the Spanish Armada's failure was far more about poor leadership, logistical issues, and bad luck than any divine intervention or strategic brilliance. The weather, lack of proper planning, and mismanagement by the Spanish commanders all played critical roles. The myth of the Spanish defeat was spun to glorify England and its monarchy, solidifying Elizabeth's position as a heroic ruler. But the truth was that the Armada's collapse had more to do with its own internal failures than any grand English victory. The narrative was shaped to elevate Elizabeth and hide the true reasons for Spain's disastrous failure. And it wasn't just Spain that tried to control its legacy through lies. Chapter 12. The Black Death, Plague or Social Control. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, has traditionally been seen as an unstoppable, tragic plague that killed millions. But what if the narrative was more complex and more sinister? While the Black Death did cause untold suffering, modern research suggests that it was also manipulated by the powers that be to control and restructure society. The chaos that followed the plague allowed the ruling elite to consolidate their power, implement social reforms, and reshape the economic landscape. Far from being a purely natural disaster, the Black Death served as a catalyst for political and economic change. The ruling classes capitalized on the widespread panic, to tighten their grip on power, using the crisis as an opportunity to suppress dissent and enforce new policies that favored the wealthy. The plague was a tool, used not only to wipe out a large portion of the population, but also to reshape society in the image of those who stood to gain from it. The Black Death wasn't the only plague that reshaped the course of history. Chapter 13. The Discovery of America, Columbus, or the Vikings. The story of Christopher Columbus discovering America has been ingrained in our history books as one of the greatest explorations of all time. But what if this so-called discovery was a myth? Evidence shows that Columbus was not the first to set foot on the Americas Norwegian Vikings had already been there centuries earlier. The myth of Columbus' discovery was carefully constructed to elevate European superiority and justify the colonization of the New World. By claiming Columbus as the discoverer, historians erased the earlier voyages of the Vikings, as well as the fact that indigenous peoples had been living on the continent for thousands of years. Columbus' legacy became a tool for justifying European imperialism, a narrative that ignored the true history of the Americas. The discovery wasn't about exploration, it was about control, and the story was rewritten to serve the needs of the empire, not the truth. And this wasn't the only historical discovery that's been manipulated to serve a greater agenda. Chapter 14. The Great Wall of China, Protection or Political Power. The Great Wall of China has long been portrayed as a defense against marauding invaders from the north, a colossal feat of military engineering. But recent evidence suggests that the wall was more about political power and control than mere defense. While it did serve to keep out invaders, it was also used to control the movement of people within the empire. The Chinese emperor wasn't just worried about foreign threats, he was concerned with maintaining internal stability. The wall's true purpose was to restrict access to the empire, prevent uprisings, and keep peasants from fleeing. The narrative of the Great Wall as a noble defense against outside forces has obscured its real role as a tool of social control. The wall wasn't just a structure to defend against invaders, it was a barrier that kept the emperor's grip on power strong and unchallenged. But the Great Wall wasn't the only structure built to control populations. Chapter 15. The Rise of the Roman Empire, Myth versus Reality. The rise of the Roman Empire is often portrayed as the inevitable spread of civilization, a force for progress and order in a chaotic world. But the reality behind Rome's expansion is more complex and darker. Rome's rise wasn't just a result of military might or divine favor. It was built on a series of lies, betrayals, and manipulation. The Romans crafted a narrative of their superiority, making it seem like they were destined to rule the world. In truth, their empire grew through brutal conquest, political manipulation, and the systematic elimination of rivals. The myth of Roman superiority was carefully constructed by emperors to justify their expansion and the violent subjugation of countless people. Rome didn't just spread civilization, it imposed its will, using lies to shape the narrative and control the future. The truth behind Rome's rise was far more brutal and far less noble than history has led us to believe, and the Romans weren't the only empire to manipulate their history for control. Chapter 16. The Myth of the Noble Savage. The noble savage myth, widely used during colonial times, painted indigenous peoples as innocent and pure, untouched by civilization. It was a narrative created to justify the European conquest of the Americas. The idea was that indigenous people, although primitive, were morally superior to corrupt, decadent European societies. But modern evidence reveals this myth was a tool to manipulate public opinion and legitimize the atrocities of colonization. By painting the indigenous people as noble yet backward, Europeans could claim their mission was one of civilization, masking the greed and exploitation at the heart of colonization. The idea of the noble savage served to diminish the complex, rich cultures of indigenous peoples, portraying them as needing European intervention. The lie wasn't just about the perceived purity of native peoples, it was about reinforcing a false narrative that justified the violence and exploitation that came with colonization. But the manipulation of history wasn't limited to the Americas. Chapter 17: The Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Catalyst or Convenient Excuse. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is often seen as the spark that ignited World War I, but what if it was merely a convenient excuse, a political maneuver to push Europe into war? The assassination by a Serbian nationalist created the perfect pretext for the Austro-Hungarian Empire to unleash its military might on Serbia. However, evidence shows that the powers involved were already on the brink of war, with long-standing political tensions, rivalries, and alliances primed for conflict. The murder was used as a justifiable reason to escalate a conflict that was already brewing. World War I wasn't caused by a single event. It was the result of years of manipulation and strategic planning by the European powers, each seeking to expand their influence. The assassination, while tragic, was simply the match that lit the powder keg. But wars aren't the only way history is manipulated for political gain. Chapter 18: The Roswell Incident, Alien Cover-Up or Military Experiment. The Roswell Incident of 1947, long considered proof of extraterrestrial life, has been enshrouded in conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. But modern investigations suggest that what crashed in the New Mexico desert wasn't a UFO, was likely a secret military experiment. The U.S. government's response to the incident, first claiming it was a flying disc before retracting the statement, fueled the alien narrative. The truth is more grounded. The military had been conducting top-secret high-altitude balloon experiments during that period. The government's shift in narrative wasn't an admission of extraterrestrial life, but a cover-up to protect classified military projects. The Roswell incident became a tool to manipulate public perception and divert attention away from the military's secret operations, turning a mysterious crash into a myth that continues to capture the imagination of millions. But this wasn't the only time the government used deception to control the narrative. Chapter 19: The Mystery of the Lost Colony of Roanoke. The disappearance of the lost colony of Roanoke in 1590 remains one of America's greatest mysteries. The colony's sudden vanishing was attributed to a variety of theories, including Native American attacks, famine, and supernatural forces. But modern research suggests a much simpler and more politically motivated explanation. The colonists likely relocated to blend with local tribes, either due to a lack of supplies or pressure from the English crown. The myth of their complete disappearance was carefully constructed to mask the failures of early English colonization efforts. Rather than admit the disastrous situation and abandonment of the colony, the loss of Roanoke was turned into a tragic mystery. The lost colony became a tool to justify future English colonization, allowing the British Empire to continue its expansion without acknowledging their early failures. But the English weren't the only ones hiding the truth about their colonies. Chapter 20: The Myth of the Wild West. The Wild West is often romanticized as a land of rugged individualism, freedom, and adventure, but this image is a myth created for entertainment and national pride, masking the brutality and lawlessness that characterized the era. Modern historians reveal that the Wild West was shaped by violence, exploitation, and ruthless power struggles. The myth of gunslinging heroes and brave pioneers overlooks the harsh realities of territorial expansion, where Native Americans were displaced and entire cultures were destroyed. The idea of the Wild West as a place of opportunity for all was a carefully constructed narrative to justify the violent colonization of the American frontier. The truth behind the Wild West isn't about heroic figures, but about the systemic violence that helped create America's empire. But the myth of the Wild West was just one of many carefully constructed stories of conquest. Chapter 21: The Myth of the Lost Cause. After the American Civil War, the Southern states created the Lost Cause myth, portraying their fight as a noble struggle for states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery. This narrative was carefully constructed to reshape public memory and romanticize the Confederacy's defeat. In truth, the Confederacy's rebellion was driven primarily by the desire to maintain slavery, not by lofty ideals of states' rights. The myth of the lost cause helped whitewash the atrocities of the war and the brutal system of slavery that fueled it. This distorted history was pushed by Southern leaders to rebuild their power, ensuring that the legacy of white supremacy and racial inequality remained intact. The story of the lost cause became a tool for political control, legitimizing the South's racist ideologies long after the war's end. But the manipulation of history to protect power wasn't unique to the American South. Chapter 22: The Manipulation of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, hailed as a victory for liberty and equality, has been mythologized as the people's triumph over tyranny. However, the revolution was far more complicated and far darker than it's often portrayed. Behind the screams for freedom, powerful political factions maneuvered to seize control, using the masses as pawns. The revolution's leaders such as Robespierre and Danton claimed to represent the will of the people, but their actions were driven by personal ambition and a hunger for power. The myth of a unified struggle for liberty masked the infighting, betrayals, and brutal repression that defined the period. The revolution's radical phase, marked by the Reign of Terror, was not about freedom, but about the consolidation of power by ruthless leaders. The narrative of the revolution as a struggle for justice was used to justify the violence that came with it. But France wasn't the only country where revolution became a tool of control. Chapter 23: The Manipulation of the Media in World War I. World War I was one of the first wars where propaganda played a central role in shaping public perception. Governments manipulated the media to dehumanize the enemy and galvanize support for the war effort. Through carefully crafted narratives, the horrors of war were sanitized, and the true cost of conflict was hidden from the masses. Governments used emotional appeals, manipulated statistics, and exaggerated enemy atrocities to rally citizens to the cause. The myth of the noble war effort was spread through posters, films, and speeches, turning war into a heroic struggle for justice. But the real story was far darker, with millions of lives lost for political gain. The media didn't just report the war, it shaped it, manipulating public opinion to maintain control over the narrative and keep people marching to their death. But World War I wasn't the first time propaganda was used to manipulate the masses. Chapter 24: The Myth of the Golden Age of Athens. Athens is often portrayed as the birthplace of democracy and the epitome of ancient Greek civilization's greatness. The so-called Golden Age of Athens is depicted as a time of intellectual, cultural, and artistic flourishing. But modern evidence suggests that this so-called Golden Age was more about propaganda than prosperity. While Athens did experience some cultural achievements, the myth of its greatness served to justify the empire's military expansion and dominance over other Greek city-states. Athens' democracy, while revolutionary, was limited to a select group of citizens, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. The so-called Golden Age was also marked by war, exploitation, and imperialism, with Athens subjugating other city-states and using them as a source of wealth. The narrative of a glorious Athens masked the darker reality of its rise to power. But Athens wasn't the only ancient civilization to manipulate history to preserve its power. Chapter 25: The Rise of the Roman Empire, Myth versus Reality. The Roman Empire is often glorified as the pinnacle of ancient civilization, its rise attributed to strategic brilliance and divine favor. But the reality behind Rome's rise is far more brutal and opportunistic. Rome didn't rise due to its innate superiority. It was built on lies, propaganda, and military conquest. The myth of Roman destiny helped shape its image as a benevolent empire bringing civilization to the world, when in fact, it was a ruthless empire that expanded through violence, deceit, and exploitation. The Romans were masters of manipulating history, presenting their conquests as noble when they were often driven by a thirst for power and control. The Romans didn't spread civilization, they imposed their will on conquered peoples, manipulating history to justify their violent expansion. And the Romans weren't the only empire to manipulate their history for control. Chapter 26. The real story of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is often seen as the fearless young peasant girl who led France to victory and became a symbol of faith and courage. But the truth behind her rise is far murkier. Joan wasn't simply a divine messenger, she was a political pawn in the power struggles of 15th century France. The French king, Charles VII, used Joan's fame to rally the French army and legitimize his own reign. Joan's victory was exploited to create the illusion of a divine mandate for the monarchy, solidifying Charles' control. Her eventual capture and execution were manipulated by both the English and the French to discredit her and break her. Influence. The myth of Joan as a saintly martyr and military leader was created to control public opinion and rally support for the French cause, even as the true story of her life was buried beneath layers of political manipulation. But Joan wasn't the only figure whose legacy was shaped by power struggles. Chapter 27. The Rwandan Genocide. Lies of International Inaction. The Rwandan genocide is often framed as an uncontrollable tragedy, a horrifying moment of mass violence that spiraled out of control. However, the truth reveals a much darker manipulation of global response. Evidence shows that the international community, particularly the United Nations and Western powers, knew of the impending massacre, but chose inaction. The myth of helplessness was used to cover up the international community's failure to intervene. Political and economic interests, combined with a fear of destabilizing the region, allowed the genocide to unfold largely unchecked. The lie that the world was powerless to stop the bloodshed only deepened the suffering, as the true scale of negligence and inaction became apparent. The international community's failure to intervene wasn't just a tragic mistake, was a political decision that allowed the genocide to happen. And Rwanda wasn't the only place where the world stood by while history unfolded. Chapter 28. The real story behind the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, is often depicted as a barrier to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. While this was part of the story, the truth behind its construction was much more about political control. The wall wasn't just about stopping the flow of refugees, it was a physical manifestation of the East German regime's fear of losing power. The government used the wall to keep its citizens trapped under communist rule, erasing any illusion of freedom. The myth of the Berlin Wall as a response to Western aggression helped to justify its existence. In reality, the wall was an authoritarian tool designed to prevent mass uprisings and maintain control over a population growing increasingly dissatisfied with their regime. The wall wasn't about keeping Western influence out. It was about keeping Eastern citizens in, solidifying the regime's grip on power. But the Berlin Wall wasn't the only barrier built to control and manipulate. Chapter 29. The War on Drugs. The lies of the U.S. government. The war on drugs was declared in the 1980s as a noble fight against crime, addiction, and the spread of illegal drugs. But modern evidence shows it was far more about political control than public health. The U.S. government used the drug crisis to justify harsh policies that disproportionately affected minority communities, particularly Black Americans. The lie that the war on drugs was about protecting citizens masked its real purpose: to exert control over disenfranchised groups and to fuel the prison industrial complex. By painting drugs as an existential threat, the government was able to pass laws that criminalized entire communities, turning the war on drugs into a vehicle for social control. The lie that drugs were the problem conveniently ignored the political and economic structures that allowed the drug trade to flourish, making the war on drugs a cover for a much larger campaign of social and racial oppression. But this wasn't the only time the government weaponized a war for control. Chapter 30: The Myth of the Roman Empire's Fall. The fall of the Roman Empire is often seen as a slow and inevitable decline, caused by barbarian invasions and internal corruption, but this narrative oversimplifies the true cause of Rome's collapse. The idea of a fallen empire is a myth created to distance Rome's political elite from the responsibility for its destruction. The truth is that Rome's collapse was the result of deep-seated political manipulation, economic decline, and the failure of leadership. Rome didn't just fall, it was deliberately undermined by those in power who were more concerned with maintaining control over their own empires than the survival of the state. The myth of the fall of Rome obscures the fact that it was the internal power struggles, imperial ambitions, and systemic corruption that ultimately destroyed the empire from within, not the barbarian invasions alone. Rome didn't just collapse, it was allowed to collapse. But Rome wasn't the only empire to manipulate their downfall to avoid the truth. Chapter 31: The Story of Spartacus, Slave. Revolt or political movement? Spartacus is remembered as the iconic leader of a slave revolt, the symbol of resistance against the Roman Empire. However, the story of Spartacus is more than just a fight for freedom. It was also a politically charged movement. Spartacus' revolt was not only about the liberation of slaves, it challenged the political and economic systems of Rome. Historians suggest that Spartacus may have been seeking to rally other oppressed groups against Rome's brutal empire. However, the Roman elite used the myth of Spartacus as a simple slave revolt to downplay the broader political implications. By reducing the rebellion to a fight for freedom, they managed to sideline the deeper criticisms of Roman imperialism and exploitation. Spartacus wasn't just a hero of freedom, he was a symbol of the larger societal forces at play, and his true story was twisted to maintain the status quo. But Spartacus wasn't the only figure whose fight for freedom was co-opted for political gain. Chapter 32: The Myth of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, often portrayed as a monumental victory for the people and a cornerstone of modern democracy, was far more about political bargaining than it was about freedom. Signed in 1215, it's often hailed as a symbol of the king's submission to the rule of law. In truth, the Magna Carta was a direct result of King John's political struggles with his barons. The charter wasn't designed to limit royal power, it was an agreement to preserve the privileges of the aristocracy while temporarily curbing the king's overreach. The myth that the Magna Carta was a victory for common people obscures the reality that it was a tool to maintain the power balance between the crown and the elite. It wasn't about the birth of democracy, it was about securing the political interests of the ruling class. And this wasn't the only time the ruling class manipulated history to protect its power. Chapter 33: The Real Story Behind the Founding of the United States. The founding of the United States is often portrayed as a noble quest for liberty and freedom, but the reality of the American Revolution is much more complex and self-serving. The Revolution wasn't just about fighting for freedom from British oppression, it was about maintaining the power and wealth of the colonial elites. The Revolution's leaders, many of whom were wealthy landowners, used the idea of freedom to consolidate their own power, while simultaneously maintaining the system of slavery and exploitation. The narrative of the American Revolution as a fight for liberty glosses over the reality that many of the revolutionaries were willing to uphold inequality to preserve their interests. What we've been taught as a struggle for justice was, in many ways, a war to secure economic and political power for the few at the expense of the many. And the story of the American Revolution wasn't the only fight for power masked as a quest for freedom. Chapter 34: The Myth of the Discovery of America. Columbus is widely credited with discovering America in 1492. But what if the story isn't quite as we've been taught? The idea of Columbus as the discoverer of America conveniently erases the fact that indigenous peoples had lived on the continent for thousands of years, and even earlier explorers like the Vikings reached America long before Columbus. The myth of Columbus' discovery served to justify European colonization and the violent displacement of native populations. Columbus wasn't bringing civilization to a new world, he was claiming land that already had thriving cultures. The myth of discovery helped create a narrative that legitimized the exploitation and colonization of the Americas. By glorifying Columbus' arrival, history erased the true story of those who lived here long before his ships landed. But the myth of discovery wasn't limited to the Americas. Chapter 35: The Weaponization of Propaganda in World War I. World War I wasn't just a military conflict, it was also a battle for the control of public opinion. Governments on all sides used propaganda to shape the narrative, manipulating citizens into supporting the war effort. Posters, films, and speeches demonized the enemy and glorified national identity, turning ordinary citizens into fervent patriots ready to sacrifice everything. But propaganda wasn't just about rallying the masses, it was used to hide the brutal realities of the war and justify the enormous loss of life. The myth of a noble cause behind the war was crafted to maintain morale and prevent dissent. The media didn't just report the war, they became complicit in spreading lies, painting a picture of heroism and sacrifice, while glossing over the horrific cost of the conflict. The manipulation of public perception through propaganda became one of the war's most powerful and dangerous weapons, and World War I wasn't the first or last war where propaganda shaped the outcome. Chapter 36: The Disappearance of the Mayan Civilization. The sudden disappearance of the Mayan civilization has long been shrouded in mystery, with theories ranging from warfare to climate change. However, modern research suggests that the collapse was not the result of any singular catastrophic event, but rather a combination of internal political manipulation and social unrest. The Mayan elites, who controlled vast wealth and resources, used propaganda to maintain their grip on power. As the society's political systems became more centralized, the elite's stranglehold over the population grew tighter, leading to widespread discontent. When the political and economic systems began to crumble, the ruling class's power eroded. The collapse was a slow unraveling, exacerbated by droughts, warfare, and the failure of their economic systems. The myth of a sudden, mysterious collapse was perpetuated to avoid confronting the reality that the Mayans' elite-driven system of control had failed. The elite's manipulation of the narrative around the Mayan collapse obscured the deeper systemic issues, reinforcing the myth that their downfall was caused by outside forces rather than internal failures. But the fall of the Mayans wasn't the only civilization to collapse under the weight of its own manipulation. Chapter 37: The Enigma of the Pyramids, Alien Construction or Ancient Technology. For centuries, the construction of the Egyptian pyramids was shrouded in mystery, with theories ranging from alien intervention to supernatural forces. The myth of the pyramids being built by aliens was fueled by the sheer scale and precision of the structures, which seemed impossible for ancient technology to accomplish. However, modern research has uncovered the true story. The pyramids were built by skilled laborers using advanced knowledge of engineering and mathematics. The myth of alien involvement was perpetuated to hide the more mundane and politically inconvenient truth. The pyramids were a product of human ingenuity, driven by the needs of an authoritarian regime. Pharaohs used the construction of monumental structures like the pyramids to solidify their divine status and control over their subjects. By presenting the pyramids as alien wonders, the true purpose of their construction propaganda, to reinforce the power of the ruling elite, was obscured. The pyramids weren't the product of alien intervention, they were tools of political manipulation designed to shape the legacy of those in power. And the construction of the pyramids wasn't the only time ancient rulers used grand monuments to control the narrative. Chapter 38: The Spanish Inquisition, Faith or Political Persecution. The Spanish Inquisition is often depicted as a religious duty to root out heresy and protect the Catholic faith. But modern research reveals that the Inquisition was far more about consolidating power than religious purity. The Spanish monarchy, with the backing of the Catholic Church, used the Inquisition as a tool to suppress political opposition and maintain control over Spain's diverse population. Jews, Muslims, and other outsiders were targeted, not only for their religious beliefs but because they represented a challenge to the monarchy's authority. The Inquisition was designed to create a homogeneous, loyal population that could be more easily controlled. By framing the persecution of non-Catholics as a religious act, the monarchy deflected criticism and obscured the political motives behind it. The myth of the Inquisition as a noble defense of faith allowed the Spanish crown to justify its brutal tactics while expanding its power both domestically and abroad. The true story of the Inquisition was one of political control, not religious devotion. But Spain wasn't the only power to use religion as a tool of oppression. Chapter 39: The Opium Wars. Imperialism masked as trade conflict. The Opium Wars of the 19th century are often portrayed as a conflict over trade rights, with the British seeking to expand their market for opium in China. However, this narrative conveniently ignores the deeper, more insidious motives behind the wars. The truth is that the British Empire used the opium trade to assert its dominance and control over China. China had been increasingly resisting foreign trade, and the British, looking to expand their imperial holdings, turned to opium as a powerful tool of coercion. The opium trade wasn't just about economics, it was about exploiting China's weakness and forcing the country to open its markets. When China attempted to crack down on the trade, Britain launched the Opium Wars, using military might to force China to accept the drug trade and open its ports. The myth of the Opium Wars as a simple trade dispute hides the reality of imperial exploitation and coercion, a story of power struggles masked as diplomacy. But the Opium Wars weren't the only example of imperial powers using trade to manipulate weaker nations. Chapter 40: The War on Terror, the Lies Behind the U.S. Intervention. The War on Terror, launched after the September 11 attacks, has been framed as a necessary fight against terrorism to protect the world from destruction. But beneath the surface, modern evidence shows that the war was not just about combating terrorism, it was also about securing geopolitical and economic interests. The invasion of Iraq, in particular, was sold to the public as a preemptive strike to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. However, no such weapons were ever found. The real motivations were to secure oil resources, reshape the Middle East, and establish military dominance in the region. The myth of the War on Terror as a moral crusade masked the political and economic objectives driving the U.S. intervention. By painting the war as a righteous battle, the U.S. government was able to manipulate public opinion and justify actions that were about securing power and influence, not protecting national security. But the War on Terror wasn't the first time military intervention was framed as a fight for freedom. Chapter 41: The Myth of the Spanish Armada. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is often portrayed as a miraculous victory for England, a triumph of English unity and naval superiority over a supposedly invincible Spanish fleet. But modern analysis reveals a much less glorious reality. The Spanish Armada was not the unstoppable force it was made out to be. While the English navy did perform admirably, the truth is that the Spanish were plagued by poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and strategic miscalculations. The Armada was also severely hampered by the weather, which devastated its fleet as it sailed homeward. The myth of the Spanish defeat served to bolster England's status and enhance Queen Elizabeth's legacy as a strong, unifying leader. It was spun as a victory of the English spirit against a Catholic superpower, when in reality, much of the Armada's downfall was the result of internal weaknesses within Spain, not a glorious, heroic English defense. The narrative that emerged after the battle reinforced the idea that the English had overcome an unstoppable foe, masking the reality that Spain's failure was much more about incompetence and circumstance than divine intervention. This myth solidified England's position as a rising world power and helped to justify the expansion of its own empire. But England wasn't the only power to manipulate its military successes for greater political gain. Chapter 42. The real story behind the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, has long been portrayed as a physical symbol of the Cold War, a division between the free West and the oppressive East. Officially, the wall was constructed by the Soviet-backed East German government to prevent mass emigration to West Germany, but the truth behind the wall's creation is more nuanced. It reveals the lengths to which the East German regime went to maintain control. The wall wasn't simply a response to fleeing citizens. It was also a tool of political control, designed to keep the population trapped under communist rule and prevent any chance of dissent. The East German government wasn't concerned only with people escaping, feared the growing resistance and opposition from their own citizens. By fortifying the border, the regime could stifle uprisings and secure its power. The myth of the wall as a necessary defense against Western influence helped the government justify its actions to the international community. But internally, the wall was a symbol of the regime's fear, not its strength. The construction of the Berlin Wall was as much about securing power as it was about political control, and the Soviet-backed East German government used the narrative of protection to maintain its authoritarian grip over the people. But the Berlin Wall wasn't the only structure built to suppress dissent and control a population. Chapter 43. The weaponization of propaganda in World War II. World War II wasn't just a battle between military forces, it was a battle for control of information and public opinion. Propaganda became a key weapon for all sides in the conflict, used to manipulate and shape the narrative of the war. Governments across the globe, from the United States to Nazi Germany, crafted persuasive campaigns to rally citizens, demonize the enemy, and justify the war effort. The U.S. government, for example, used propaganda to glorify the fight for democracy, portraying Axis powers as evil and threatening freedom. But propaganda didn't just build morale, it dehumanized the enemy, turning entire nations into faceless monsters to make mass violence more acceptable. The Nazis, on the other hand, expertly used propaganda to justify their imperial ambitions and atrocities, portraying themselves as the saviors of Europe while hiding the horrors of the Holocaust. The myth of a just war was carefully maintained through visual and written media, masking the brutality, hatred, and political motives that underpin the conflict. Propaganda became a tool not just for encouraging enlistment, but for erasing the true horrors of war. The fight for control over the narrative was just as important as the battles fought on the front lines. And propaganda wasn't just used in World War III, it has shaped many of history's most pivotal moments. Chapter 44. The myth of the lost colony of Roanoke. The disappearance of the lost colony of Roanoke in 1587 remains one of the most puzzling mysteries in American history. The colony's sudden vanishing was initially attributed to supernatural forces or attacks by indigenous tribes, but modern evidence suggests that the story of Roanoke's disappearance was far more complicated and far more politically motivated. The colony's founders, led by John White, had left for supplies but never returned on time due to the ongoing conflict with Spain. When White returned to Roanoke 3 years later, he found the colony abandoned, with no signs of violence, only the word Croatoan carved into a post. This eerie message has been interpreted in many ways, but recent theories suggest that the colonists may have integrated with local tribes or were abandoned due to logistical issues. The myth of the colony's sudden disappearance helped cover up the failure of early English colonization efforts. The myth of an unexplained mystery allowed the British to save face, obscuring the reality that Roanoke was an early failure in their ambitious attempts to establish a foothold in the New World. But Roanoke wasn't the only failed colony in history that became a tool for political storytelling. Chapter 45. The Myth of the Roman Empire's Fall. The fall of the Roman Empire is often depicted as a tragic, slow collapse caused by internal corruption and barbarian invasions. While these factors were undeniably part of the empire's demise, the true reasons behind its fall are far more politically charged. The myth of a fall helped mask the reality that the Roman elite were complicit in the empire's destruction. Corruption, yes, but also political infighting, mismanagement, and the loss of control by the ruling class played critical roles in the empire's collapse. The emperors had grown weak and disconnected from their people, and the military elite had become more focused on personal gain than protecting the empire. As the once great empire crumbled, the myth of an inevitable fall allowed the political elite to shift blame elsewhere, painting the collapse as something out of their control. The idea that barbarian invasions were the primary cause obscures the reality that it was internal decay, political corruption, and the empire's inability to adapt that truly brought about Rome's end. And Rome's fall wasn't the only time a great empire's collapse was hidden behind a myth of inevitability. Final payoff: the truth behind history's greatest lies is now exposed, and one thing is undeniable: power has always been shaped by deception. From the Trojan horse to the fall of Rome, these lies were more than just stories, were weapons. Weapons used to manipulate, control, and rewrite the past to benefit the few. The greatest empires, revolutions, and wars weren't driven by ideals of freedom or justice, but by those who crafted narratives to secure their own power. These lies were never about protecting the people, they were about maintaining control at any cost. The myths that we've been taught were never meant to inform us, they were designed to keep us in the dark. Now, as we uncover these truths, we realize just how deeply history has been manipulated, and how much of what we thought we knew was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion.